40 minutes ago. I had to get showered, and I did think about just coming on the bike, but I would look quite bad and probably not smell very good either. So my name is Kevin Anderson. I'm the Zenström Professor at the University of Uppsala in climate change leadership. I'm there for 50% of my time, and the other 50% is in the UK at the University of Manchester, where I'm Professor of Energy and Climate Change. My colleagues, who I will point to in a minute, have arranged for me to cycle from Malmö, or from Lund to Malmö, and then Malmö back up to Uppsala, stopping at different places on the way. And I cycled about 350 kilometres on the way down, and then got a lift for the final bit. So it's quite difficult. I noticed they're not with me. So they've arranged it and then sent me out. So, and today, Sweden is a very windy place. And today the wind was really hard all the way. So it's been a difficult. Very nice bit was there's a big hill. Well, that was the best bit. Oh, so nice because there were trees on both sides and it was not windy. So I thought,
it was tailwind today, wasn't it?
Tailwind? There was no tailwind, I can tell you. It was across and partly to the front. I'm hoping tomorrow for tailwind because I have to go to Gothenburg tomorrow. Anyway, I should also say that I have partly have an industrial background. I used to design and build offshore oil platforms. So it's quite a different background to what I'm doing now, but there's a lot of crossover between them. And most of my focus is actually on energy. So I should say right at the beginning, I won't be talking about agriculture and food emissions, but they are really important. So we must think about what we do with our carbon, with our methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions from food production. They are important. About 20% of the warming that we have seen so far is from agriculture. The other 80% is mostly related to energy. But food is really important, but it's not my area. I do work with colleagues on it a little bit, but it's their area and I work with energy. So I've called this talk here From Paris to Sweden, 2 degrees centigrade integrity and the climate law, the new Swedish climate law. I have a bad habit of getting faster and faster when I speak, so if I'm talking too fast, tell me to slow down. Yeah. And if anything is not clear, just ask me to go over it again. And I should have started with an apology that actually I don't speak Swedish. I'm actually trying to learn French whilst I'm here, which is a strange thing to do. I think I should really make an effort with Swedish, I think, now, because I'm probably going to stay here a bit longer. But it's a very difficult language. Yeah. It has very unusual vowel sounds. They're hard to say, the vowels in Swedish. Anyway, so I have a Twitter account for those people that use Twitter, at Kevin Climate. I put quite a lot of my work on there, or I make links to my work, and the tour that I'm doing now is called Carbon Cycle Sweden. So there's a link to that, to some of the things that we're doing on the CEMUS website at the University of Uppsala. And these are the people that sent me off. Isabel had this great idea, and then disappeared off for a holiday. Aaron was told to arrange things, and he foolishly asked me one day, he said, "How fast do you cycle?" I said, "Oh, well, between 32 and 34 kilometres an hour." I didn't mean, he didn't say how fast to cycle with luggage over long distances in the wind. You didn't ask me that. So he planned everything with me cycling between 30 and 34 kilometres an hour. So it's been... I managed 31 up to Engelholm today, and then I dropped to 29 since then. I think I'll be 15. And then Isaac is the director of the Centre for Environmental Development at Uppsala, and Jesse is one of my other colleagues that I work a lot with. So I'm going to start this talk with my concluding quote from a man called Alex Steffen, who this came from a Twitter discussion that we had last year. And he said that winning slowly is basically the same thing as losing outright. In the face of both triumphant denialism, and that's what you see really in the US and Australia, less so in Sweden, and even the EU, you see a little bit of that, but not a lot. And predatory delay, deliberate delay, I think we see lots of that in Sweden, the UK, the EU, all the progressive countries show a lot of deliberate delay. Trying to achieve climate change by doing the same thing, the same old ways, means defeat. It guarantees defeat. So I think at the moment that's the best that we are doing. We are putting things in place that we know are going to slow things down. And we are guaranteeing defeat on climate change at the moment. So I'm going to come back to that quote later. I'm trying to show why I think that is the case. So what is the international agenda that we have on climate change? And I should say, it will sound like I am not being nice to Sweden. I think Sweden is a wonderful place. If I was younger, younger and single, I would seriously think about trying to move here. But I'm in Sweden at the moment, so what I'm saying is about Sweden. So I'm being critical of some of Sweden's approaches. But if I'm in the UK or Denmark, I'm just the same there, critical of their approaches. So I'm not blaming Sweden for all of the problems. What we have committed to in Paris was to really an agreement that we've never had anything quite like this. So it was quite an achievement, even though I think a lot of problems are in the Paris Agreement. There's still a big achievement. And it commits us to take action. I think that's important. It doesn't say to talk about it or to put policies in place that don't deliver. It says actually to take action, to hold the increase in temperature below 2 degrees centigrade, compared with the pre-industrial period when we started burning fossil fuels, and ideally to pursue 1.5. And let's also be really clear that 2 degrees centigrade is not a safe threshold. 2 degrees centigrade temperature rise as a global average, that's about 5 or 6 degrees difference in the poles. So it's a huge change in the poles, and we will definitely melt the Arctic for quite a lot of the summer at that temperature, which changes the way that the global oceans move heat around the planet. So that will change the weather all the way around the planet, one way or another. And we're also seeing, this year particularly, a rapid increase in the rate of melting in the Antarctic as well. We know at 2 degrees C that many people will die. They'll be poor, they'll live a long way from here, they will have had very low emissions, they'll not be part of the problem, and they'll typically be non-white. And we've known that for 20 or so years, and yet we haven't done anything about our emissions. So we haven't really cared about the people we knew would be affected, and of course that does also include our own children. And we've also promised to do this on the basis of the best science, in line with the best science, and on the basis of equity. And no country in the world takes that seriously. The new Swedish climate change law just ignores equity. And the equity I'm talking about here is the equity between the poorer parts of the world and the wealthy parts of the world. Right. So it's a different package that is used in the software here, so I think some of these slides will be a bit of a mess, I think. So this says, what is our response to this challenge? Well, I think we have to be honest to start about where are we today? Now, if we're not honest about where we are, then it's very hard to know what we do about it. The first report from the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's the United Nations body that brings together all of the science every few years. That came out in 1990. Now, if I talk to my students, I often say that's before their parents met. Now, it's not completely true in this room. Some of you but there are one or two here. Your parents probably, you were probably born around that time or a little bit after, maybe one or two of you, so. But most of you probably can remember 1990. So that was something we knew everything we needed to know in 1990. We had the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, a really big international event with lots of promises about what we were going to do. Yet in 2016, carbon dioxide emissions in that year were 60% higher than in 1990. And in 2017, just last year, they went up by about 1.5%, and they may go up again this year. So what we've had is 28 years of politicians, some business leaders, some NGOs and charities, and quite a few scientists saying really positive, wonderful things about how well we're doing. But actually we've had complete and utter failure on climate change. And I think the younger generation should be very, very angry about this, and then try and channel their anger into doing something worthwhile. But people, as I often say, people with no hair, dyed hair, or grey hair have failed the current younger generation. And we've chosen to do that. And we knew what to do, particularly our policymakers and our scientists. Why have we failed? Well, we've tried a whole litany of technocratic, and I think it's a great word, that's one of the few Swedish words I've learned, spindlery, cons, frauds. So the first thing we tried was offsetting. when you pay other people to diet for you. So in other words, you pay them to reduce their emissions. There's always a small, poor country in Africa we pay, something like that. We pay them to reduce their emissions, and we can carry on flying or driving. So that's the approach we use. Then we have the clean development mechanism. Sounds quite good there. That's just the state does the same things. So the UK says, rather than us reduce our emissions, we'll pay Ghana to reduce their emissions, or Nigeria, or some other part of the world. We've got the emissions trading scheme in the EU, where you can trade carbon dioxide emissions, but the amount of permits that are available is huge, so the price of carbon has been made so low it doesn't make any difference. And we're now planning, particularly in Sweden, to plant lots more trees so we can expand Arlanda Airport. Plant a tree, expand an airport. And when all of this fails, because it will do, and it is failing, we've also already got lots of work underpinning the new climate law in Sweden, the climate change law in the UK, of things called negative emission technologies. These don't exist. These are technologies that are in the imagination of a few scientists and a few engineers. And then that is that future generations will have to design these technologies, make them work, and they will suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. That's what we're planning on. That's what the climate law in Sweden relies upon. That's what Johan Rockström's recent paper relies on. That's what the UK climate change law relies on. These things don't work, they don't even exist. Yet every single scenario that's in the IPCC about what we need to do uses these. And they're very cheap apparently, because they're in the future. And then when that fails, we already have engineers and scientists looking at geoengineering. And the main option they're looking at there is firing rockets into the stratosphere and then spreading sulfates in the stratosphere, so that's the top part of the atmosphere, spreading sulfates in there so it reflects sunlight back out into space. We're trying all of these things, and we're planning some really dangerous things, and we haven't tried to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions. So we've tried everything but reduce our emissions. And it's tempting to say, well, isn't that just China or India? Well, no. Just look at Sweden or the UK or Denmark or France. Sweden is a leading nation in the EU on climate change. It has very low carbon electricity. It's got an international reputation as a progressive country, and coming from the UK, I think that's a fair reputation. It does feel like a very progressive, really well-structured, well-balanced society in many respects to me. And yet Sweden remains a high-carbon country. Once you take account of all of the emissions in Sweden, aviation, shipping, the government conveniently ignores them, and so do a lot of the scientists, and the imports and exports, so this laptop here made in China, whose emissions is that then? Is that the Chinese emissions or ours? So if you take those things into account, what we import and what we export, Sweden's seen no reduction in emissions since 1990. So we hear lots of wonderful things about how well we're doing, but it's always because we deliberately use selective accounting. We ignore a lot of the things. So if you include them all, no reduction. Same to say UK, France, Denmark, and Norway up 40 to 50% since 1990 for Norway. Belgium up 25%. So wealthy parts of the world are not doing very well. So where do we go to from here? So it's a more honest position of where we are, which is a fairly bleak place, it's a challenging place. Well, we had the latest set of reports from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They came out in 2014, and what it said in the report was that what really matters, this is the language in the report, is cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide. In other words, they build up. So whenever you emit some carbon dioxide from a car or a plane or a ship or whatever, a heating system, it stays in the atmosphere. Most of it will stay in the atmosphere almost forever, not just 100 years. For quite a lot of that carbon dioxide will be there changing the climate in 10,000 years from now. So if you drove here, we're going to change the climate for 10,000 years. So it's the total amount. And that means we use the language in the UK with some of my colleagues. We've been working on this way since 2005 of carbon budgets. We have a total amount of carbon dioxide that we can emit. And the more we emit now, the less we can emit in the future. So it's like having an income, your salary for life. So this is all the money you will have in your life. And the more you spend in the early years, the less you have in the later years. And that's what we have for carbon dioxide, related to temperature. And that makes it far more challenging from a political perspective, because it doesn't mean that what we do in 2030 or 2045 or 2050 doesn't matter really. What matters is what we do in every single year. And that means that, unlike what we normally like to think about, policymakers say, well, we'll put these things in place, and by 2035 or 2045, we'll be doing really well. Well, it's too late. They need to be doing things today. So let's try and quantify the Paris Agreement. There's a few graphs here, and don't worry too much about numbers, it's more the shape of things, really. So these are our emissions of carbon dioxide that we've had since 1980. So this is 1988 to 2100, and this is carbon dioxide emissions.
Is it global? Global?
This is global, yeah. This is global, yeah. Global carbon dioxide emissions. And you can see things like the Indonesian fires there. You can see September the 11th here. So you can see things occurring. And before Paris, we were heading somewhere up there to 4 to 6 degrees centigrade of warming. Something like that. Now that's just a completely different planet. The difference between now and an ice age is 5 degrees. So we're talking about something that would normally occur over thousands, tens of thousands of years, occurring in just 100 years. So, you know, evolutionary-wise, we can't deal with that. Nature can't deal with that, the rate of change. Now, because we had the Paris Agreement, every country in the world submitted a pledge about what it would do. Its promise to try and reduce emissions. When you add all the pledges together, it comes to 3 to 4 degrees centigrade of warming, which is still a dramatically different planet from the one on which we live. And really, the truth is, the only reason we've moved from the upper curve to that curve is not because of good climate change policies. It's because the bankers chose to collapse the world economy. So we had the banking crisis in 2007. So, you know, we can't even thank our clever scientists and policymakers for that. The only reason we're there is because of the bankers. And that's about the only good thing they've done, I think. Now, what's happening with the world economy, it looks like we might go back up to the upper curve. So there's no guarantee we'll actually even hold here. But what we do know, from the IPCC, from the internet, from the science basically, we have this carbon budget from 2018. All right, this is looking at... Oh, it looks there's little odd bits here because it's a different package. We have about 750 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide that we can emit for 2 degrees centigrade. So this is us. That there is 750 billion tonnes. Now that probably won't mean too much to many of you, but we currently emit about 42 billion tonnes. So 750 divided by 42 gives you about 18 years. So 18 years of current emissions, if it was a straight line, and then you have to drop off, nothing left. So it's the as I say, that's the budget, that's the total amount that we can emit. And that means we have to have zero carbon energy at a global level by about 2050, which is not that far away really. And when I say zero carbon, I mean everything. Planes, ships, trains, industry, refrigerators, everything in our life has to be zero carbon, not low carbon. Completely move away from fossil fuels. If you have low carbon, it just builds up in the atmosphere and the temperature will just keep going up. A bit slower, but it will still keep going. But we also signed up to do this on the basis of equity. In other words, richer countries would lead the way and poorer countries would have a little bit longer to make that transition. So that other picture was a global picture for 2050. So the question then, to me, is what does this mean for Sweden, or indeed for the UK, or other wealthy parts of the world? So what I'm saying here for Sweden is very similar for the UK. Or indeed most of the same for Germany, probably France, maybe slightly different for Italy and Greece and places like that. So to limit warming to 2 degrees centigrade, we have a pie, a carbon pie. We like pies in the UK, so that's what I use it here. But I should really get a bouler or something like that. But I can't find a picture of a bouler that I can then take a slice of. So we have a carbon pie, and that's the total amount of carbon dioxide that we can emit. And then what we have to do is negotiate between every country in the world is how big a piece should they get. So this is what negotiators try and discuss when they meet every year. And what we've done with some colleagues is we've worked out how much should the EU get. And there are different ways of doing that. You can do it on the basis of population or the size of the economy or what your historical emissions were. So there are different ways of doing this. So you can end up with a slice for the EU. Now it could be a bit bigger, it could be a bit smaller. So I'm just showing it as one slice here, but we have a range in the work we did. And then you ask, how much of that should Sweden get? So what proportion of the EU, what little slice should Sweden get? And then we can work out, again, how do we do that on the basis of population or what do we do it on? So there are different ways to divide the cake. And what you get is a range So Sweden gets about 300 to 600 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. Now again, that probably means not much to many of you unless you're a strange climate change person. But Sweden emits, including aviation and shipping, but not including imports and exports, it emits about 50 million tonnes a year. So again, a bit of very simple maths tells you that for Sweden, we have 6 to 12 years. And really it should be at the lower end of this. That's not a lot of fairness in that one. It should be nearer this end. So 6 to 12 years of current emissions. And I'd say that would be very similar for the UK or Germany or France. Now it does include aviation and it does include shipping, which in most analysis does not include, but it's not including imports and exports. If you include those, if you include imports and exports, then Sweden's emissions are somewhere between 80 and 100 million tonnes, almost twice as much. But there's a lot of uncertainty when you do that as to quite what it means when you talk about laptops or clothes or cars being made elsewhere. There's a lot of uncertainty in the numbers. So excludes those. Now the headline message for Sweden in terms of mitigation, in terms of reducing our emissions, is that we have to start bringing emissions down at 10 to 15% every single year. And 10% is the start. So within 2 years or 3 years, you've got to be at 15% every year. Now, again, maybe that doesn't mean too much, but just to give a feel for that, that's about 3/4 of our emissions would have to be removed, compared to today, by about 2025. So just in the middle of next decade, 3/4 of all of our emissions. So it's a huge thing to do. And that's only for 2 degrees centigrade, not for 1.5. And say 2 degrees is already dangerous. And we fully decarbonise energy by 2035 to 2040. So 20 years from now, basically, fully decarbonised energy. Now, how is this different to the Swedish climate change law? You're all aware that we have a climate law now in Sweden. So that was passed this year, which is good that it's got one. The graph's played out a bit. Anyway, so this is the Swedish climate change law, and this is the best interpretation that we can get of it. We think this is a bit optimistic, but this is what the Swedish government we think is planning for. It's based on the Swedish EPA, Environmental Protection Agency data. So about 6% per annum. Now, it excludes aviation and shipping, and it also has no carbon budget framework, so it hasn't really got any science behind it. And it ignores international equity. It basically says Sweden should have a very large piece of the cake and poor countries should have a few crumbs. And that's the same as the UK does. Oh, I'll show you in a second. Now, there's a Swedish scientist, Johan Rockström, who works a lot on these things. And he had a paper that came out recently called the Global Carbon Law Paper. And they said about 7% per annum reduction at a global level. But both of these include negative emission technologies at huge planetary scale. So both are requiring the next generation to find a technology to suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They also both ignore equity, and they both ignore aviation and shipping. So let's say it's probably unreasonable, I think, to rely on technologies that do not work, that we don't have. I mean, yes, let's research them in our universities, but let's not pretend that they're there, that they work. So let's ignore negative emission technologies. Let's seriously take account of equity issues, so we have to do things a bit ahead of poor parts of the world. And let's include our emissions from aviation and shipping as well. And then what happens when you plot that? Well, it looks more like that curve. And you start to see why policymakers want to use negative emissions and ignore equity and not take account of planes and ships, because it's very challenging. Now, it sounds like I'm picking on the UK, on Sweden rather, but the UK is not much different. So the UK, that's the pathway for the UK bringing carbon emissions down out to 2050. If you take away all of the sort of noise on the picture, you have like that, and if you work out for 2 degrees centigrade, it should be somewhere like this. So it's the same thing for the UK. So even the most progressive countries in the world that have climate change laws are planning much more for 3 or 4 degrees C future, or alternatively are planning to take a large part of the 2 degrees C pie and leave very little left for the poor countries. So we're not doing things particularly well. So what would we need to do in Sweden if we were to act seriously about climate change? Well, there are 3 time frames I'm going to talk about here. The first one is what we can do immediately. And this relates to our behaviour, the sorts of things that we do, and our practices. That's like our routines, the norms that we have, how we might drive to work, or we shower every day, or things like that. Things that we ever think about, really. And what's interesting is that at a global level, the top 10% of all emitters at a global level are responsible for about 50% of global emissions. So half of all emissions come from that small group. And if that small group were to reduce their carbon footprint to the level of the average European, which is that too much to ask? If we thought climate change was serious, would that be too much to ask if that 10% did that? That's a 1/3 cut in global emissions. So if we were really serious about climate change, we could do something like that very quickly. It wouldn't be enough, but that's the other 90% of the world population doing nothing. So that would be a very good start. And I think it's interesting, if you took a room like this and worked out all the carbon emissions from all of you over the last year, my guess is, there's a rule of thumb called Pareto's rule, that 80% of the emissions from people in this room will come from just 20% of the people sat here. Now, it might be 50% of the emissions come from 10%, something like that. But most of the emissions here will come from a small group. So if you look at the people next to you, they're the high emitters, or maybe you are. So it is interesting. We see this, we see this big skew, even in wealthy countries, and even in countries that are much more equal, like Sweden. If you went to the UK, there'd be a massive difference. So, the question we need to ask then is, because we know the emissions are mainly responsible from small groups of people, or at least the most of the emissions, then who's in that group? If we can say who it is, we can then aim our policies, governments can aim their policies at those people. Well, the first people I would talk about are climate scientists.
Yeah, exactly. Climate scientists.
Yeah, in my view, they're a disgrace. They keep flying around the world, telling little people beneath them to reduce their emissions. And these are actually, it's a cartoon of quite a few of them. I have lots of arguments with them, because I think it's wrong. I stopped flying in 2004, and I think it is wrong for us to be doing this. We should be leading by example. So some of these people, this man here and this one here, will always fly first or business class as well. Even worse. But they think they're so important that what they're doing means that their work is more important than their emissions.
And they eat plenty of beef.
Yeah, I'm sure they do. And they all live in big houses and get very well paid, yeah. But then just behind them, and in business, and certainly probably in business class as well, are policy makers, and just behind them are the business leaders. And so behind them are people that fly, frequent flyers. So people that fly 2, maybe 3 times a year, and then there's people that fly lots more than that, of course, as well. So, and they're the ones that drive aviation. It's not the people that fly once every 2 or 3 years to fly to Benidorm or to go to Egypt or something. They're the ones that aren't driving aviation. Aviation growth is driven by the people that fly very regularly. So we know who that 10% are. Now the second thing we have to do is, it's all got a bit messed up again, is the near term. So those are the things we can do almost immediately. In the near term, we must make sure that everything we have, whether it's our laptops, our cars, our refrigerators, are very efficient. If you look at an A-rated refrigerator, when you buy a refrigerator, it's got a little label on it. Look at an A-rated refrigerator and look at one that's A+++. The A+++ uses 60 to 80% less energy than the A for the same size fridge. Now, why are we selling A's? They should just be banned. So we should be saying that they all have to be, the most efficient ones have to be only sold. And next year, I would say you make them more efficient. So you tell the companies, every year the things that you sell, whether it's cars or refrigerators, will become 10% more efficient. And this is the maximum amount of energy consumption that you can have in any one appliance. Now, what you'll hear is the financial directors of the companies will squeal, and the engineers will just get on and deliver. So don't take too much notice of the financial directors. They've always said these things aren't possible, and then they go ahead and do it, or their engineers do. And it provides a long-term market signal. So a company would know what it has to do for the next 10, 15, 20 years. So that point is really good for companies. They would know what the emissions of their products have to be. You'd know what, if you're making cars, you'd know how much more efficient they have to become, or whether they have to move to become electrical or something else. And if you put that together with the behavioural part, then I would argue you can reduce the energy consumption in wealthy parts of the world by 40 to 70% in 10 or 15 years. Now, that won't be easy. I'm not saying any of this is going to be easy, but it is achievable. We can do that. And that's not everyone, of course. In the UK, a lot of people are in fuel poverty. Can't afford to heat their homes in the winter. And so for them, we really want to make sure they use up more energy. Even if their emissions go up, that's a good thing, because they need to be heating their homes for themselves and for their children. The final thing we need to look at in the medium term, what we need to start now, is on energy supply. And I call this here a Marshall-style program for building energy, low-carbon energy supply. And that's like the Marshall Plan for after the Second World War, when we had to reconstruct Europe after we'd blown it up. So it's the same sort of scale we're talking about here. And there are plenty of things we can do, whether this is a geothermal plant in Iceland, wind turbines, nuclear power stations, hydro or solar. All of these are very low carbon electricity, even nuclear. I know Sweden has nuclear, and there's lots of arguments whether it's a good or a bad thing. There are lots of issues with nuclear power, but it is low carbon. That's one thing it is. And just to give some sort of feel for the numbers, these are all between 5 and 15 grams of carbon dioxide for every kilowatt hour of energy they produce. And just to, that might mean nothing to you, but just to compare that with gas-fired power station is 450 grams compared with 5 to 15, and coal would be about 900. So these are all very, very low carbon. But they're all electricity. And usually for most industrial countries, only 20% of the energy we actually consume is electricity. The other 80% is not. Now, Sweden's a bit different, so is France. In Sweden, 30% of what you consume is electricity. But 70% of the energy consumed in Sweden is not electricity. It'll be oil, gas, and coal, probably. So you have to think about those other sorts of energy as well as electricity. And if we're going to be fully decarbonised, fully zero carbon energy, then we need to have a major program of electrification. We need to electrify lots more of our energy, our industry, our transport. I mean, the heating system already has quite a lot of that here in Sweden now. So we need to do that quite quickly. And that's a lot of work for the next 30 years or so, doing that. It's not a quick job doing these things. And I'll come back to that later. So what would this look like? If you were to play this out in Sweden, what sort of things would we need to do to deliver on our Paris Agreement? Well, there are just a few examples. Firstly, all the older buildings that we have in Sweden, or in the UK, or anywhere, need to be retrofitted to make them more efficient. And Swedish buildings, okay, are much better than British buildings. I always sort of joke that a Swedish tent is about as efficient as a British house. And I spend a lot of time working and going to Ireland, I have colleagues in Ireland, and a British tent is about as efficient as an Irish house. So imagine how bad the Irish houses are. So we need to retrofit our existing properties to make them much, much more efficient. We need to make sure that our towns are having no petrol or diesel cars in them. I would argue even further, I don't think we should be using electrical cars in cities either. I think cities should be for people, not for big chunks of metal. But you know, and I think the cars may be really important, electric cars and things like that, for the rural environment, but not in our cities really. We should build our cities very differently. I mean, I always think with cars, it's interesting that what's a typical Volvo weigh? 2,000 kilograms, and it usually has one person in it that weighs, in my case, 90 kilograms. So you've got 2,000 kilograms of metal being taken for, say, 10 kilometres to move me, 90 kilograms, just down the road. What to do? Get some shopping, to pick up 5 kilograms of groceries. I'm carrying 2,000 kilograms of metal with me. We think that's normal. I mean, it's these things we make normal, and then not only do we think it's normal, we make huge spaces in our cities so that all of these metal boxes can come together and talk to each other, called car parks. So think what we've done to our cities, and it's all happened gradually, but we've normalised this. It's become the normal way that we live. So we need to question that, I think, a lot more. We need to make sure we have passive house for all new buildings. That means they don't use any energy. Now, on the way down here, I stopped off in a passive house that was built 14 years ago. And there's a family living in it, a normal family. They're not hippies or anything like that. It's a normal family doing normal things. They moved in 14 years ago, and they've used no heating in Sweden in 14 years. which is quite impressive. And now the house costs, it looks like a normal house. And that's the other nice thing. It doesn't look like a strange house. It's like a normal house. It costs 20% more to build. That was all. But of course the price you pay for a house is always different to the price of the building house anyway. So 20% more to build, used no energy since 2004. And they also have thermal heating for water on the roof. So not all, but quite a lot of their water is heated by the sun as well. So really good design. We need to have charging systems. I would say for bikes in our cities, I think electric bikes are something that really could change how we work and how we live and work in our cities. Because you don't have to get all sweaty and you can ride. Anyone can ride an electric bike, and you can probably ride 20 kilometres quite comfortably, and you can use more of the power if you want to, or less of the power. So I think that's good for cities. But I think for the rural environment, electric cars may be appropriate. So more charging equipment in the rural environment. We need to fly much less, and we should have no more business in first class, because that uses up far more energy. If you go business or first class, you're taking up a lot more space. So the energy consumption is 2 or 3 times more. We need to make sure that virtual communication works. It's still rubbish, really, virtual communication, or virtual conferencing, or even just talking to friends elsewhere in the world or in our own country. So I also think it's odd that we can put 500 people in one of these things, and we can send them spinning across the sky at 800 kilometres an hour. We can't get virtual communication to work. So if we spend all the money we're going to spend on expanding Arlanda Airport on virtual communication, Sweden can have a wonderful virtual communication system. And there are some really good examples. I was at Linköping University last year at an event, and it was the virtual conferencing facilities were just fantastic. When I went home, I couldn't remember who was there and who was beamed in virtually. Because all the images of the people beamed in, they were just sat the same size as the rest of us. They were just sat behind us. And at the break time, we went and got cups of coffee, and we just sat chatting to people on screens like that. Someone in America will be talking to me. Now, the only thing was that some of them had different time zones, so some of them looked a bit more tired than others. But it worked. It was superb. So we can do these things. And of course, we do need zero carbon supply. And I think it's quite a shame not to see many solar panels in Sweden. It's quite a sunny country. I've done quite a bit of work in Gotland, and they all sort of say they have this massive spike in the summer when the Almedalen comes along, and the Stockholm weekend and all those things, or fortnight. And yet they have almost no solar panels. So if you had solar panels in Gotland, it's depending which year you look at, it's the most sunny place or second most sunny place in Sweden. At the same time, you'd have all these people arriving, the solar panels would be producing all this energy. So there'd be really good ways to combine the two, but you don't do it. Now, I think the problem with it all sounds very challenging, and should we do it all? But I think we can describe this without trying to overplay it. I think we can say that this is a really positive story that policymakers could be using. And maybe this is slightly different for Sweden, but definitely this is important in the UK and most European countries. That there's a massive number of jobs in this. People have to be doing this work. So there's a huge jobs agenda for the next 20 or 30 years. So 2 generations of people doing high quality work. And you can't just import the things that we make. This is to be done in the country. So in Sweden, you've got to retrofit your houses, you've got to electrify your system. That has to mean people in Sweden have to do it. You can't just buy that in. So there's a lot of local labour, high quality jobs, which often policymakers are really interested in, because these jobs vote. You improve the urban air quality, which I thought was a bit odd in Sweden when people told me it's bad in some of the cities. So I was in Umeå a few weeks ago, and they said the air quality is really bad in Umeå because it has an inversion layer. So it didn't look like to me there was a lot of traffic, but they said the traffic they do have, the fumes are trapped in this inversion layer, and so they have really low air quality. So if you respond to climate change, the air quality is better. If the air quality is better, that's better for our children's health, particularly when they're growing. It means their education is better. So there's a whole lot of things that really improve from that point of view. I think it's quite interesting to think about the tourist industry. So you have, say, staycations, where you stay more locally. At the moment, this is common for Sweden, and I know the numbers for the UK, it'll be the same there. In colder countries, and I know it's been a bit hot recently here, but usually it's not quite so warm. In colder countries, people fly out more than they fly into them, for tourists, from a money point of view. So in the UK, for every pound that flies in to come and see the Queen or Buckingham Palace, £2.73 flies out to find the sun. So Britain hemorrhages money out from tourism. and I'm pretty certain Sweden's just the same. So if you had more tourists, try to embed more tourism in your own country, and there are people looking to do this in Sweden, then that would keep more money within Sweden. I think it would improve our living environment in our towns and our cities if we started to respond to climate change, like taking the cars out of them, better air quality. And in the medium term, it would also mean lower energy costs, because renewables are getting so much cheaper. So already solar power is often cheaper than some of the alternative fossil fuels. So, and its prices are still coming down. But the problem then is if we save money by not spending as much on energy, what do we do with the money? We spend it on a flight to Fiji or something. So you have to be careful about this rebound effect that we call it. And I also think it provides, I think, for a policymaker, the idea of policymaker will say, I'm thinking about your children's future. That's a good thing. I think most parents would think their children's future is quite important. Or maybe not, I assume that's the case. And I also think that, and this is partly Sweden's fault, Sweden is a progressive country. It's just 10 million people live here, but people look at Sweden and what it's doing. So it has a much bigger reputation than 10 million people would suggest. So I think when people look at Sweden, they expect to see international leadership. So I think because you have had that progressive history, then there's sort of some extra responsibility on Sweden to show some leadership within the EU. And I think if Sweden showed international leadership in the EU, even though I don't particularly like Macron, but he's really interested in climate change, I think you'd see other people in the EU engaged in these issues. And then the EU might tighten up its policies on climate change, and that would affect what China did, because China wants to export things into the EU. So you can imagine Sweden catalysing, bringing about a change in the EU helping drive China, and you could quite quickly see a change in the global attitude towards carbon dioxide emissions. And I know it's easy to say, what about America? Because they've got that strange orange man that controls it. But remember that many of the mayors and the states in the US are really interested in climate change. And he'll be gone in 4 to 8 years. Well, less than that now. So lots of mayors are still interested. So even the US is interested in climate change. So to conclude, because we chose to fail on climate change and leave it so late, climate change is now system change. It wasn't originally. We could have just taxed carbon fuels a bit. We could have used some light regulation if we started in 1990, but we haven't. There's almost no carbon budget left now, so we're living with a whisper of carbon budget for 2 degrees centigrade. And so it becomes a point where we have to intervene much more in society. If we follow the logic, the science of climate change and carbon budgets, it asks fundamental questions about our norms and our paradigms, how we view the world, what we think is good and bad. We need to transform energy supply, as I talked about before, really rapidly. And that will take a bit of time to do, but we need to start it now. We need to make sure that all our appliances meet the absolute best that's available. And whenever we buy a new one, it'll be an even improved standard. We need massive changes in the behaviour and practices of people who are high emitters. Now, look at what we're doing at the moment. And it relates to this one. We need to reframe values, success and progress. This week, next week, and the next couple of weeks after that, we'll be celebrating people with massive carbon footprints called footballers. We hold these people up as heroes. But these are the people that have massive footprints. None of them are showing any example. We see the same with stars and celebrities in almost all areas of life. The people that we hold up as being these wonderful people in society are always people that have massive carbon footprints. So we need to rethink that. There are other ways to measure success in the world other than just how big is your house, have you got a private jet, how big is your carbon footprint. There are other ways to think about that, and we need to think about these things now. We also, I think, need to develop an economic model that is fit for purpose. The current economics is not able to deal with these issues. I personally think the current economic system the economics that we use is almost of no use. It couldn't even understand the economic crash we saw, and that wasn't because of climate change. So that was because it couldn't understand its own way of thinking. So I think we need new ways, or different ways to think about economics. And there are plenty of other ways of thinking about economics than the current one that we have, which is obsessed by economic growth. This has to start now and all be completed within 3 decades. So this is quite a big challenge. And most of us here will probably be here in 3 decades' time, or at least a reasonable chunk of that time. I'm hoping for a bit of stem cell research so that I'll still be cycling in 2050, possibly on an electric bike. But we've got a long way to go still. When we think about people in the world that are impacted by climate change, now I'm not saying at the moment there are very few events that we can say were caused by climate change, but there are lots of things that have happened where we can say that climate change has made it worse. So this is already happening in many parts of the world. And there are some events we think are very likely to have been caused by climate change. But do we think this is, we have these people here suffering elsewhere in the world, and yet in a few weeks' time in Halmstad, lots of these ugly yachts with stupid people on them will be arriving in Halmstad, parked up in the bay outside. I took some photographs when I was there last year. Some of them even have jet skis on the bay. Space travel, we've got Elon Musk and Richard Branson pursuing space travel when we're trying to address issues of climate change. But I always say about space travel that I'm not completely opposed to it, provided it's single tickets. Because it'll be the wealthy with high carbon footprints that use it. So let them go to Pluto, they just can't come back.
A question. Do you have any thoughts about, I think it's a good question, how do you get this message out to normal people? Because I believe 80% of my friends, they doesn't care.
Yeah.
They don't bother about this. Otherwise, try to tell them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are lots of answers to that, and some work and some don't work, and they all vary depending on who your friends are. You're here, so you can talk about these things with other people. I think firstly, when we talk about these things with other people, they don't change their mind straight away. And they don't probably tell you that if they do change their mind, they probably won't tell you. But they might be changing the way they're thinking over the next month, 2 months, a year. So I think, my friends, I was speaking to someone the other day, and he's been arguing with his parents. He's probably in early 20s. Argues a lot with his parents. He said, well, my parents are taking no notice. I said, like, one thing I can guarantee is when you're not there, your parents will be telling their friends about what you're saying to them. So we just need to have some faith here, in a sense, and we need to engage about it more. The more people that talk about it, the easier it becomes to talk about these things. But also not always talk about it in terms of climate change. Talk about it in terms of improving the quality of the city air for their children's future, for their children today. So I think there are other ways you have to word these things. I haven't got any wonderful answers. We all have to think of the environment we live in and the people we talk to. What would be the best way to get those engaged? And there are always some people that you haven't got hope with. Okay, well, don't waste your time with them. Talk to some other people. Because in the end, we only have to talk to... There's a recent paper came out about 2 weeks ago, an academic paper, and they were looking historically. You only need about 20 to 25% of the population to think something is important, and then you can have fundamental change occur really quickly. Because most people just want to get on with their lives. I don't think everyone should be interested in climate change. We'll probably need about 25% of the population to be interested in it. And others will they'll just buy a more efficient fridge or a more efficient car, or they'll use an electric car, or they'll use public transport. As long as the legislation is there, they'll just look at it. So I think it's a bit more hopeful than we don't have to convince everyone, but we should talk about these things. Do we care about our own children's future when we still think it's reasonable to have 3 tons of Range Rover or Volvo or Tesla? And I mean, they're a terrible car as well, those new electric cars. They're made for men, basically, who have some other problems. So they're really like all these big cars. And so the Tesla's like that. I mean, buy a Renault Zoe, that's a much more efficient car than a Tesla. The new Teslas that are coming out may be much better. They're smaller, a lot more efficient. And people say, this relates to sort of the issues of things like migration. We have no space for people coming here. This is a house I cycle past when I'm in Cheshire, which is outside Manchester. Probably belongs to a football player or vice chancellor of a university. And we have no room for Syrians. Well, there's probably about 5 or 6 bedrooms in there they could be living in. So we're not short of space to help people, because we're seeing far more climate migrants that we have caused around the world. And even Syria wasn't a climate change issue. But they did have a drought for 12 to 14 years, which won't have made things any easier. So when stressed communities have additional stresses, other problems arise. But it wasn't caused by climate change. Do we care about other species? When Sweden, as I said, a very progressive country, is building a gas terminal in Gothenburg. You don't even use much gas. So Sweden said to the world, we think we should carry on, we think we should lock our energy system into ongoing fossil fuel use for another 40 years. Is that a signal for Sweden to be leading with? So ask your politicians when it comes to this election. Are they caring about your children's future? Well, it doesn't look like it at the moment. Do we really care about... It's a magical planet to live on. I sometimes use some pictures at the beginning of our planet in space. You know, it's just a little dot and around it is just blackness. It's the only one we've got. There's nowhere else to go, even with our space travel. There's nowhere quite like Earth. And we forget how wonderful this place is. But you know, we're still merrily flying off to Bali and Thailand or essential climate change conferences in Cancun or other exotic places. So we need to think about doing things differently. The choice is in the end between what we often refer, well, people often say to me, but there's the real politic of these things. Is that the term you use in Swedish? Yeah. I said, well, yeah, there's also the real climate. And the real politic we have has been here for about 30 years, the current version of economics and politics. The climate's been doing its thing on this planet for 3 to 4 billion years. And physics has been working fairly well for about 13 billion years in our universe. So which one's going to win in the end? Which one's more important? 30 years of current economics or 13 billion years of science and physics? No, we know which one matters. And it's not the economics. We have to change the economics to fit with the physics. I go back to Alex Steffen's quote, that winning slowly is basically the same thing as losing outright. And I think at the moment all we're doing is, you know, we're in the face of both triumphant denialism and predatory delay. That's what we're doing at the moment. Trying to achieve climate action by doing the same old things, an LNG terminal. The same thing, in the same old ways means defeat. It guarantees defeat. So we are deliberately planning for defeat at the moment. But we don't have to do that. And in Sweden there's an election year. The policymakers require our votes. I'm not saying you should have to agree with what I'm saying, but you should, I'm sure you probably do, but we do need to engage more with our policymakers, write to them, write to the press, get letters saying what we think is important. But that's a way quite depressing for this, so I use this quote regularly from Robert Unger, that at every level, the greatest obstacle to transforming the world is that we lack the clarity and imagination to conceive that it could be different. And the future will be radically different. It'll either be different because we've made these changes that are necessary, and that would look quite different in the world, or because we've not made the changes, and then we'll get lots more climate change. So the future will be radically different. But not only have we got to imagine what a prosperous, good quality of life would be for us and our children, and for other species as well, but we also then have to provide some clarity of how do we get there. So how in Sweden would you actually get to a very low carbon society by the mid-2030s? What would we need to do in Sweden, or the UK, or in Germany, or in China, or wherever it might be? So I think we have some idea of what we need to do. The thing we seem to be lacking, it seems to me, really, is actually courage. Is to step up and actually say we're going to make these changes, because we know what to do, most of the time. So thank you very much for listening.
Our most important energy source in Sweden is bioenergy, mainly from the forests.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? That is not electricity.
No, it's not. And I think bioenergy is for someone like Sweden, it's important. But I think we have to be careful not to overplay how much we use. So in Sweden, there's a plan for using lots more of it. The problem with that is if you start planting a lot more trees, it has quite an effect on the soil. And the soil itself can end up with more emissions going into the atmosphere. So you have to be very careful what we do about some of these things. So in Sweden, I think, because of its geography, probably it can use quite a lot of biomass and biofuels. But I'm not sure it could use much more. But for other parts of the world, that's going to be really difficult. So many parts of the world are going to rely on they plan to rely on biofuels, and they always intend to import it from Brazil or some other part of the world. So, and they are not without big sustainability repercussions. There's a lot of fertilizer often used in it. You affect the soil. When you chop the trees down, you affect the whole ecosystem. So when I do a lot of my cycling, you can smell them before you get there. You're cycling through the forest and you can smell that around the corner there'll be a massive area that's been chopped. Things were living there before. So we have to be quite careful about doing these things. It's not without problems, but I think in Sweden you have some scope for using it, particularly for heating, which is what you use it a lot for now, in district heating.
When you talk about the CO2 bucket,
Yeah.
750.
Yeah, 750, yeah.
Does that include the bioenergy? Or
Well-
because you lose it, but then you bind
Right.
it.
Well, that's the total amount of carbon dioxide we can emit.
Yeah.
So it
But
doesn't
does
really-
it include the bio?
Well, that's the total carbon dioxide that we can actually emit for 2 degrees centigrade. If you used bioenergy, if you used bioenergy and you assumed that the bioenergy sucked in as much CO2 as it then emitted, then you could carry on using that. It wouldn't affect your budget. Because it doesn't do that. When you suck the CO2, when you use bioenergy at the moment, you then put it on a truck, where you've got to chop it down. You then put it on a truck powered by diesel. You take it somewhere to be chopped up, and then you burn it in some power station somewhere, or whatever, or in a heating system. In fact, when you burn it in a heating system, a lot in Sweden, it's also burned with waste, which has plastics in it as well. So it's at the moment, and probably there's been some fertiliser in helping with its growing. So it won't be zero emissions. It will be lower emissions in Sweden than the UK that imports it from. At the moment we burn it in our power stations. We import it from America. We import great big logs of wood that are put on ships, transported to Drax power station, which is the second biggest power station in Europe. And then we burn this wood in the power station. But we ship it across the ocean first. So,
I also wonder how, if we plant trees again, we chop them down and we plant new one, will they be big enough, fast enough?
Yeah, that's a big issue. And that again depends on things to do with the soil and what sorts of plants you grow and what sort of species you grow, and also what happens to climate change. So the climate changes then, what we're seeing at the moment in Sweden is a bit unusual. I'm not saying it's caused by climate change, but if you see these sorts of things happening, then what you thought was going to be a good thing to grow in Sweden may not be a good thing to grow. So we have to be careful about that sort of time frame issue. It might take you hundreds of years to grow what you're going to burn and put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Bring the message in multiple ways, not just in one way. And so you've come here to hear me talk about climate change issues, but when you talk with the people that you know, you will frame it in the way you think is the best way to talk to them. And that will be different depending on who you're talking to. And so I think we need to find ways of communicating climate change that are appropriate for the people we're talking to, but it should be honest. We should not pretend that things are good or bad. We should just be honest about it, but use the right sort of framing for it. So this is one of the reasons I think we need to engage more with humanities, the social sciences, with artists, because we really need to be thinking about climate change in our soaps on television, in our songs and things like that, but not always the language of climate change. It can be the language of something else. So it can be to do with other good things, to do with our society, to do with jobs that can link to climate change. So I think, yes, we do need to reframe it in multiple ways. So if you're talking about it in the UK, which is a very multicultural society, I don't think, a slideshow like this with some graphs and some grey-haired professor stood at the front, it works for some people, but no, it doesn't work for most people. They're not going to turn up on an evening and listen to this. So we have to find other ways of communicating. And that's why I think it's really important for those of us as scientists to engage with other people about how to communicate these issues. But I'm not telling you how to communicate it. You should do it the way that you think is appropriate. And despondency is a risk. Some people think it's just too big a challenge. And you definitely hear different responses to that. So the one this morning, they said, they really like, I was at Oakley, who produce milk. Yeah. And, as you can expect, they're sort of a green company. But they were it's a massive challenge, we're up for it. They're sort of really upbeat and we can do these things. And other times you go to places and they sort of, that looks really just too depressing. So people do vary quite a lot as to how they respond to these issues.